Well, good evening, everyone. This is Janice Courtcamp and doing Syria Face to Face, episode 14. And tonight we're going to discuss how the U.S. manufactured the war in Syria. And for many people, that will seem like a strange statement to make, but I hope to prove it to you. The idea that this is a civil war, that this is an organic, spontaneous, popular uprising. I intend to dismantle that myth tonight, as many of us have been doing over the years. And so I hope that you will follow along with me. I put a resource at the description of this video, and this is a timeline that I wrote a couple of years ago, actually, and we're going to highlight many of the things on that timeline. Wow, welcome everyone. I see a lot of people already, so I hope you all are having a good Sunday. And happy Mother's Day to mothers out there. Today was a terrible tragedy in Syria. A village near Idlib was attacked yet again, and many people died. 6 children have died, 5 are in hospital wounded. And I saw the pictures from the funerals, and it's just heartbreaking. This is actually a little Christian town, beautiful Christian town near to Idlib, where tens of thousands of terrorist fighters are in control. And so my heart is grieving with those mothers who lost their children to it, as so many mothers have in Syria, for a war that was created against them. And so this is what we're going to talk about tonight. When I was younger, I was studying archaeology, and I'll never forget the first day that we got to go to a dig site, and it was a huge area. It was a turf farm, so a huge flat field where they were going to be planting grass to transplant elsewhere. And so we were just faced with these huge fields that were freshly overturned dirt. And our archaeology professor said, this is a site that I'm very sure has artifacts. So it could be projectile points, arrowheads, handmade tools from even thousands of years ago. So we were very excited, but to us, it just looked like dirt. It looked all the same. And it wasn't until our professor very patiently showed us how to see and what to look for. And very soon we were very painstakingly walking those fields in a systematic, organized way. And over time, we were able to see what he was talking about, and things that had been manipulated by human hands literally just would pop out from the field at you. And so you have to train your eyes to see and your brain to think along certain lines. And this is what has happened to me over the course of this investigation over the last six and a half years now of studying Syria and other Middle Eastern conflicts, and the role the U.S. and other players have had in that things just, now things just pop out constantly every single day of evidence and proofs that support my theory, as well as many others, that the U.S. created the war in Syria and that there was never any intention on their part to do anything positive for the Syrian people as a result. And so we're going to go through this timeline that I posted up at top and add a few things in there and discuss some of these points. I have hundreds of resources that prove this theory, and many of them come from official government sources, as well as, all the way to on-the-ground eyewitness accounts. So I'm going to go through the material very quickly tonight, and we'll just take it from there. If you have any questions, please post them in the comments. In the next couple of days, I will be answering each and every one of those. So again, welcome. I really appreciate you joining me tonight, and we'll get into it. Okay, in Aleppo, on one of my trips, I made 6 trips to Syria as research trips over the war, and I spend several weeks there each time, traveling around the country and meeting with as many Syrians as I can. And one time I was in Aleppo, and I saw a man in the coffee shop where I was, and I recognized him as Father Daniel. Father Daniel is a Flemish priest who has lived in Syria throughout the war. And I was so excited to meet him. And he was just an amazing, impressive man. And he lives in a monastery outside of Aleppo that had been surrounded for years by various terrorist groups. And the monastery was protected by Syrian soldiers as well as Hezbollah soldiers and others. And they managed to survive throughout the course of the conflict, at least so far. And so I was talking with him and was thrilled to meet him, as I said. But he did an interview a couple of years ago that I think summarized the conflict very well. And I'm going to read for you a little bit of that interview. He said, "The idea that a popular uprising took place against President Assad is completely false. I've been in Kara, which is the name of the monastery, since 2010, and I've seen with my own eyes how agitators from outside Syria organized protests against the government and recruited young people. That was filmed and aired by Al Jazeera and by other media outlets to give the impression that a rebellion was taking place. Murders were committed by the foreign terrorists against the Sunni and Christian communities and everyone else there, in an effort to sow religious and ethnic discord among the Syrian people. Well, in my experience, the Syrian people are actually quite united." And he went on to say, "Do you not know that the media coverage on Syria is the biggest media lie of our time? They have sold pure nonsense about Assad. It was actually the rebels who plundered and killed." And he said, "Do you think that the Syrian people are stupid? Do you think those people were forced to cheer for Assad and Putin?" As we go through this timeline, a friend of mine by the name of Senator Richard Black, he's the Virginia State Senator, and he's a U.S. Army Colonel, retired. He was a major in the Judge Advocate General's office. He's a Marine combat veteran. He's a lawyer licensed to practice at the U.S. Supreme Court. And, he has many other qualifications in addition to being a Virginia senator. And he said, "If conspiracies weren't real, nations would not need intelligence services." So as people have talked about, "Oh, you're a conspiracy theorist." No, I'm a conspiracy realist. Conspiracies happen on a daily basis. And this conspiracy against Syria is very well documented and really not well hidden. If we had a true media with real journalists doing their actual job, the American people would have heard about this many years ago and risen up against this atrocity. Good evening, everyone. Back in 1949, of course, was the first CIA attempted coup in Syria. This is very well documented. There was a book written by one of the operatives. He was on television interviews. And we've been meddling and mucking around in Syria ever since. In the 1980s, in fact, there was a document written that is available in the CIA archives talking about how the U.S. could go about undermining the Syrian government then in the 1980s. I want to take you back to 1978 when Jim Jones, he was an Assemblies of God pastor, a disciple of Christ pastor, committed the mass murder suicide of his cult in Guyana. 918 people, including 300 children, drank what we call Kool-Aid. It was actually Flavor Aid was the brand, but we call it Kool-Aid, and committed mass suicide. And ever since then, that has entered the lexicon of people around the world about drinking the Kool-Aid. Don't drink the Kool-Aid. And so I want you to stop drinking the Kool-Aid and just hear me out, and you make up your own mind about these things. Like I said, Syria has been in the gun sights and the sights of the CIA and the US for many decades, since 1949. And I've talked in previous episodes about things that happened in the 1980s and 1990s. And just very quickly to refresh, Israel is an expansionist entity, and what they want to do is expand throughout the region into what they call the Greater Israel Plan. And that means taking over much of Syria and Lebanon and Jordan and some of Iraq. And this is very well known to the people in the Middle East and anybody who studies these things. In the 1980s, in order to prepare the groundwork, so to speak, for that expansion, the Oded-Yanan plan was written, and this talked about splitting the Middle East up into very small sectarian or religious-based states that would guarantee that these tiny little states would never have an army large enough or powerful enough to stop the advance of Israel and their ambitions in the region. The Oded-Yanan plan evolved into something that the U.S. neocons wrote for Benjamin Netanyahu, who became Prime Minister of Israel at that time. So he's been Prime Minister and in leadership basically for the last 20 plus years. And this document was called A Clean Break. And in that document, it was said that the U.S. would take out Iraq and Syria basically for the benefit of Israel and their expansionist plans. And I've talked about this, like I said. Those neocons that wrote A Clean Break went on to form the Project for the New American Century, that were all these guys that came into power under George W. Bush. And at that time, using 9/11 as a catalyst, they created the so-called War on Terror. And the two primary targets, or the three, of this War on Terror were going to be Iraq, Syria, and Iran. Of course, none of those countries had anything to do with 9/11 whatsoever. It's just that 9/11 got all of America fired up. We wanted war. We wanted to attack somebody. A lot of people just did not care who it was. We trusted our government to say, oh, we need to take out these guys. But in fact, this had been planned for decades prior to the 9/11 very conveniently timed event for the neocons to take power. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the years from basically 2001 through 2015. And if you don't believe me about Israel, you have to watch the 3 previous episodes. But I just wanted to tell you about a talk that a rabbi in Israel recently gave, Rabbi Eliezer Kashdil. And they videotaped this talk, and he said in this talk, oh, the Arabs are happy to be our slaves. They want to be our slaves. We are in no danger, he said. Our hand is strong. It is our duty to conquer, a holy commandment to conquer Greater Israel, even if not one bullet was fired at us. That this idea of conquering Greater Israel is, in fact, they consider it to be a holy commandment. Back in 1948, David Ben-Gurion, basically who's the George Washington, the founding father of the modern Zionist state of Israel, according to his biographer, said to the General Staff in May of 1948 that we should prepare to go on the offensive with the aim of smashing Lebanon, Transjordan, and Syria. So this, like I said, has always been the plan. So in 2001, 9/11 occurred. President Assad of Syria actually sent his condolences his deep condolences to the U.S., to the people of the United States, and to the government for that tragedy. And he also worked with Pentagon officials and others to provide intelligence information on Al-Qaeda at that time. And the Pentagon officials said called it invaluable assistance and intelligence. However, because the neocons had no interest in having good relations with Syria and President Assad, even though he had been signaling, he had just taken power in 2000, he had been signaling that he wanted good relations with the West, and very clear signals. But the neocons were bent on destroying Syria in any case. And the neocons created what was called the 7 countries in 5 years plan. But again, the major targets of that were Syria, Iraq, and Iran, but also included Libya, Lebanon, Somalia, Sudan. In 2001, Colin Powell had a very agreeable meeting, according to most parties, with President Assad in Syria. But the pro-Israel lobby and the neocons were having nothing to do with it. And the pro-Israel lobby in 2002 pressured members of Congress to put sanctions against Syria. And in fact, the White House, George W. Bush himself, was kind of pushing back on these, saying we're going to try to negotiate with him. You know, basically they're saying we're going to try to get Syria under submission to our war on terror. And so this isn't good timing, but the Congress went ahead and did it anyway and got the approval of George Bush on it. So there's always been a little bit of tension regarding the Syria policies from the United States, but eventually that all kind of went in one direction for the most part. In 2003, of course, Israeli leader Benjamin Netanyahu appeared before our Congress, the leader of a foreign country, appeared before our Congress to urge America to invade Iraq and take out Saddam. Now, he wanted us to take down Saddam Hussein, who, of course, had been our guy. He was the U.S.'s guy. We'd been using him since he was a 17-year-old or in his late teens to do some of our dirty work for us. And we had promoted him in Iraq, and he came to power, but then he went rogue, and that's when the Iraq War started. But Benjamin Netanyahu said, I guarantee, and he's very adamant about it when you see the video, he's giving his personal guarantee that if the U.S. were to take out Saddam Hussein, that it would have enormous positive reverberations on the region. And of course, what he meant was it would be good for us. And in fact, he did say that later. He said Israel is benefiting from one thing, the attacks on 9/11 and the U.S. Efforts in Iraq. At that time, in 2003, the same time that Netanyahu appeared before Congress, Charles Glass, who's a well-known journalist in the Middle East, and I met him a couple times in Damascus. He is very knowledgeable of the situation there. Charles Glass wrote an article called Is Syria Next? Now, remember, this is in 2003. And in that article, he said many things, and he mentioned the clean break document, and he talked about how Israel and the U.S. had wanted to wage war against Iraq as a way of containing Syria. And the clean break document called for weakening, containing, and even rolling back Syria. I've got to catch up on my notes here. And he said that the advice that Pearl, Feith, and other American Friends of Israel gave Netanyahu in 1996 became the Bush administration's policy in 2003. He said in that article, the reason stated in public for invading Iraq regarding weapons, the infamous weapons of mass destruction that were never found, for example, or a totally false accusation of colluding with Al-Qaeda. This is what they said Saddam was doing. In fact, that was a total myth, and even Charles Glass said that in 2003. But never, ever did any of the neocons say that Syria was an intended target from our war against Iraq. But Charles Glass said that in 2003. And he said also that everyone in Syria senses that following its invasion of Iraq, the U.S. is going to turn to Damascus. And let's see here. He said that he talked about Colin Powell's trip to Damascus. And let's see, this goes into quite a bit of detail, and I don't want to take up too much time. But he said he was talking to a man by the name of Jacques Hakim, who he had known for 20 years. He's Syrian, and he said that at that time in 2003, things were getting better in Syria, but he feared American interference would reverse the tentative steps towards liberalization. In 2003, the U.S. invaded Iraq, lying to us all, talking about mythical weapons of mass destruction. The only thing that were found were some old chemical weapons, and we knew Saddam had those because our CIA had helped him acquire them in the 1980s, which then were used against Iran in horrific chemical weapons attacks. And Foreign Policy magazine exposed these CIA documents and wrote about it a couple of years ago. Dick Cheney, of course, at that time, and others said the war would last only a few months, and now it's 2019. We're talking 16 years later, 15, 16 years later, the U.S. is still in there, Iraq's a mess, and trillions have been spent, as well as at least 1 million Iraqis now gone. And the country, the government is weak, the army is weak, has been weakened, and they're just starting to find a little bit of their footing again, but it's very difficult because they still have the American presence in there that is trying to control their country. Also in 2003, Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, at that time in Israel, said that Iran, Libya, and Syria should be stripped of their weapons of mass destruction. So you can see the propaganda starting, the momentum starting to take out Syria as well as Iraq. He called them irresponsible states which must be disarmed of weapons of mass destruction, and a successful American move in Iraq as a model will make that easier to achieve. At that time, John Bolton was U.S. Undersecretary of State, and said that at that time Israel was concerned about the security threat posed by Iran, the same rhetoric we're hearing now, and stressed that it was very important to deal with Iran, even though our focus was on Iraq at that time. So what I'm talking about is all of these various machinations and moves and propaganda and everything that's been leading up to undermining Syria and ripping it apart. So this is what I'm going over. That the war in Syria did not start in March 2011, which is where virtually every single Western journalist puts as the start of the war. The war against Syria started in the early 2000s, and this is what I'm trying to prove to you tonight. In 2003, Colin Powell, who was Secretary of State at that time, went to Damascus again and basically had a set of polite dictates. for President Assad. And in order for President Assad to be considered a friend of America, basically he had to get on this kill Iraq, invade Iraq, help us in Iraq effort, even though at the time President Assad knew that that was a huge mistake. The dictates also included that he would have to stop sending any weapons to Hezbollah or any support to Hezbollah in Lebanon, and to close any and all offices of any resistance groups that support the resistance against Israel. These were just some of several requests, and I think one of them was that anything negative written about Israel must be stricken from the textbooks of the curriculum of the schools. Now, President Assad at the time considered these dictates to be advice. He refused to accept them as dictates, and Colin Powell went back to the U.S. empty-handed with promises that President Assad would turn into our puppet and do whatever it was that we told him to do. In 2004, George Bush made his infamous, you're either with us or against us speech in this so-called war on terror, which most of us have come around now to just calling a war of terror. Because of his lack of cooperation, President Assad in Syria was labeled by a White House official as being part of the axis of evil. And this is what they always do. Pompeo mentioned Venezuela or Bolton being part of an axis of a troika of tyranny or some stupid thing. They always come up with these little catchphrases to get your brain drinking the Kool-Aid to accept whatever war they want you to accept. So that happened in 2004. In that year, the U.S. put additional sanctions on Syria. And they charged Syria with supporting terrorist groups. When it's actually very well known that Syria has been fighting against extremism and terrorism, throughout the course of many decades. Labeling Syria at that time as an unusual and extraordinary threat, President George W. Bush prohibited the export of U.S. products other than food and medicine to Damascus and prohibited flights between the two countries. Fascinating. This is 2004. This was critical. The sanctions also sever banking relations with the Commercial Bank of Syria, freezes assets of Syrians and Syrian entities suspected of involvement of terrorism or weapons of mass destruction development. That was reported on by Reuters in 2004. So what they did was they cut off Syria from the global financial world. And up until that point, people could use credit cards and things like that. That was all gone, and that's only gotten steadily worse over the course of the years. In 2005, there was the Hariri assassination in Lebanon. President Assad was accused of that, and a tribunal was set up. I'm not even going to get into Lebanese politics. That is talk about a labyrinth of complexity. But a very prominent politician by the name of Hariri was assassinated in 2005. The West very conveniently accused President Assad of Syria of ordering that assassination. Now, understand that a special tribunal was set up, I think it was in 2005, to confirm that President Assad of Syria had ordered this assassination. Well, the tribunal is still going on, and we're talking how many years later? It's been going on for, over a decade and a half. And they have not found any evidence to support the idea that President Assad of Syria was involved in the assassination of Hariri. But just like all these stupid fake chemical weapons attack allegations, nobody cares about what is true. All they do is just make the accusations, and people think that because U.S. intelligence agencies or the media reports on it, that it must be true. Let me tell you a little bit about U.S. intelligence agencies and how they disseminate information. You have all these thousands of agents and operatives around the world. I mean, then you have, the middle tier and then the upper tier of management and, officers and this sort of thing. And then you have the very utmost tier, which are political appointees and politically based directors. And so everything that comes from the lower echelons goes through that choke point of the political leadership of the intelligence agencies. And then whatever the political leadership of our intelligence agency wants the US Congress to know, wants the president to know, wants the media to know, wants us to know, goes through them first. And so this is where the real breakdown occurs, that at the leadership level, you have agenda-driven, political-based leaders and directors that are filtering and channeling information to the president, the Congress, the media, and the people only in the direction that they want us to go. So this is where the breakdown occurs. Nonetheless, in 2005, President Assad of Syria pulled the Syrian troops that had been occupying, that had been a force in Lebanon there for a number of years because of the war that had been going on there. He pulled the Syrian troops out of Syria. This is 2005. In 2005, Christiane Amanpour of CNN went to Damascus to interview President Assad, and I posted this interview not too long ago. And she's there in Damascus, face to face with the president of Syria, and she just tells them very nonchalantly that the U.S. Is talking regime change regarding him, and that they've already picked out a new leader for Syria in 2005. Keep in your mind that the violence didn't begin in Syria until 2011. But 6 years before that, basically, Damascus, the government of Syria, knew that the U.S. was gunning for him. The U.S. was already invading and destroying Iraq, and that they were already punishing him, Syria, with sanctions and propaganda to start demonizing him and either forcing him personally into submission, or if he would not to submit to our dictates, to punish and force the country against him. So this is what was known in Syria, very well known in the mid-2000s. Very conveniently timing-wise, after President Assad pulled the Syrian troops out of Lebanon, one of the first things that happened was Israel invaded southern Lebanon. They were driven out in a humiliating defeat by Hezbollah with the help of Syria. And this actually changed the entire dynamic in the region, because this was the first time that the Arab armies had so soundly and like I said, in humiliation, defeated and driven out the Israeli forces. So now all of a sudden the Israeli leadership is panicking and realizing that they have a real threat, not to their, not in the way that we're told it is, but a threat that means that there are armies that are strong enough and determined enough not to allow them to get away with what they've been trying to get away with, the expanding and taking over all of Palestine, and the expansion and taking over the lands of other countries and the resources of other countries, including water and oil and natural gas. Am I going too fast? Is this timeline making sense to people? I hope so. We're up to 2006. In 2006 also, there was an operating embassy in Syria, in Damascus, and it didn't have an ambassador at the time, but it had a charge d'affaires, which is, a slightly lower level person than an ambassador. And that charge d'affaires wrote a report at the end of 2006. And it's a cable that was released via WikiLeaks. There were several steps outlined in that cable of how to undermine the Syrian government, how to foment, create sectarian distrust. So what they were trying to do, like I said before, Syria it's really hard to get numbers because they don't do census taking based on religion, as far as I understand. But basically, the population of Syria is 70% or as much as 75% Sunni Muslims. Then there's about reported 13% or so of Alawites, 10% of Christians, 5% Druze. There are traditional Shiites, a large number of traditional Shiites, and other sects and groups as well, like the Yazidis, for example. So it's a very diverse country. But what the United States wanted to do was among the Sunni population to stir up concern, because President Assad is an Alawite. His wife actually is Sunni. Much of the government is Sunni, much of the army is Sunni. But they wanted to artificially create tension in Syria between the religious groups. And this is something that is an old colonial powers trick. The French were doing it in Syria. England did this all the time, everywhere. And this is kind of the mentality of people in Washington and the UK and Israel. This is what they're trying to recreate, is this kind of divide and conquer situation. So this cable that was done in 2006 was talking about how to go about doing exactly that. Another interesting part of the cable, though, was a couple of times in the document, it talks about that in 2006, Syria is actually, and President Assad, in a much stronger position, both domestically and internationally, than it was even in 2005. So President Assad, personally, as well as Syria as a country, was growing in popularity, in strength, and success. And, there were a lot of really positive things going on. And so this cable, even though it talks about how to undermine this government that is popular both in the country and in the region, but still we have to take them down. We have to put him under submission or tear Syria apart, basically, is what it comes down to. And it talks about how to play on Sunni fears of, it's just all about creating sectarian mistrust and hatred. And this is something that, for those of us who travel to Syria, and for anyone out there, all of you out there who have come to know Syria as a country, this is something that is a precious part of the society, was the mutual respect and the harmony between the religious groups. And so this document is one of many proofs that the American government was actually determined to undermine that religious harmony and peace between the religious groups. And they also talked about working with the Kurds and highlighting Kurdish complaints. And we've been working with the Kurds, and Israel's been working with the Kurds for a number of decades. In fact, Israel started working with the Kurds to kind of talk them into forming their own little nation states as far back as the 60s, but also the 1980s. And the U.S. has been trying to work with them to split off a part of Syria for a very long time, to create their own little mini state as part of this Odejinan, what they call the New Middle East plan of breaking up the large, powerful countries into small states. So just a little review there. From 2006 to 2010, The U.S. was funneling millions of dollars into something called the Movement for Justice and Development. Again, this is before the violence ever began. For 4 years, millions of dollars, $6.3 million. And this went to Syrian dissident groups. It went to opposition people creating television channels and creating propaganda that would be seen in Syria in order to create this mistrust and the hatred between religious groups and to try to foment rebellion, try to incubate it, to create it. I had a thought there. At this time, we were working with a lot of Syrian expats, people who had left Syria, many of whom had left in the 1980s because they were part of the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Muslim Brotherhood had become outlawed in Syria in the 1980s after they had risen up in violent rebellion against the government. Many of them ended up in America. Many of them actually ended up in Texas, and they were actually, I found out through Syrian friends, and they are actually Sunnis in Texas, that they were sponsored in large measure by George W. Bush, the Bush clan, to come to Texas. So if you're concerned about the Muslim Brotherhood in Texas, you can point your focus right at George W. Bush for making that possible. Not George W. Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush, I believe, it was the one who started bringing the Muslim Brotherhood over into Texas. So at that, it's important to note that President Assad, when he came to power and over the years, he was trying to make reforms in the government to reduce corruption, this sort of things, very difficult. But one of the major reforms that he'd done was bring in the internet. And so the Syrian people, all this time and all the while over the war, have had full access to the internet. So I've made this point before, but it's very important because, the Syrian people were able to see what Western media were saying and what the Western governments were saying, and they were actually able to get online and say, this isn't true. Let me tell you what's really going on here. And that's been a very powerful force throughout the course of the war for many of us, like myself, to research and find out the truth of what's happening there. But I will tell you who was not listening to all of those Syrian people that were on Facebook and on various websites and trying to get this truth out. The mainstream media would never listen to them. And they represent the vast majority, the great majority of the Syrian people. And their voices, their proofs, their videos, the massive rallies that were put on around the country in support of President Assad, none of that was paid any attention to by mainstream media. The only people they paid attention to were people like the activists that were funded and trained by the CIA and other intelligence groups to be their eyes and ears on the ground in Syria. This has been a setup that has been a long time in the making. In 2007, George W. Bush and Elliot Abrams, who's so hard at work bringing freedom and democracy to Venezuela, and everything I've been talking about in Syria has been done also against Venezuela to create war there, by the way. So George W. Bush and Elliot Abrams met with the Syrian expat Muslim Brotherhood leadership in the White House. This was reported on in the Wall Street Journal, and that's on that timeline, that's fully resourced timeline that I gave you at the top of the screen. And the purpose of the meeting was, how do we get our friends of the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood to help us undermine the secular, women-empowering, successful, popular, stable government of Syria? This was the whole purpose of that meeting in 2007, 4 full years before the violence broke out. In 2007, also, the Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist Seymour Hersh wrote a very critical article called The Redirection, which many people listening, I'm sure you're familiar with that. But in that article, he described the shift in Middle East policy of the U.S. to isolate Iran or Israel, to strengthen Israel and Saudi Arabia, and to actually strengthen and work with extremists, fundamentalists, violent, what everybody in the world would call terrorists, in order to achieve their goals. So in 2007, Seymour Hersh, The Redirection, is a critical piece of evidence to understanding this. Let me let Little Dog in. He's crying. Okay. In 2007, ABC sent Diane Sawyer to Syria, and she spent a week there. And Diane loved the place, and she was raving about it. She did several special reports, and those videos are available on YouTube, and I gave you links in that resource page. And she was talking about its secular society, the respect and protection for all religions, the freedom and rights for women, that was very modern, very welcoming and gracious. She loved the country, and this was in 2007. She didn't mention in her reports or when she returned home that the people all seemed to be living under some kind of brutal tyranny, and they were miserable, and they all wanted freedom and democracy to be brought at the hands of the U.S. It's funny how she never, seemed to see that there in 2007. In 2008 and in 2009, President Assad of Syria was voted the most popular Arab leader in regional surveys. And one of those surveys was actually conducted by the U.S. because they were trying, in my opinion, I believe they were trying to gauge how successful they were being at undermining President Assad. And it turned out the opposite, that they had not been very successful. In 2008 and 2009, he was the most popular leader in the region. In 2009, we had the gas pipeline situation where Qatar, and nobody knows how to pronounce the name of that country, sorry, so I say it differently sometimes. Qatar, Qatar, it's a tiny little country in the Persian Gulf. And Qatar and yeah, it cut off. Oh, okay. Sid said, it looks like it's saying that it cut off here, but it looks like Sid's saying it's still going on. So where was I? We were talking about the gas.
Okay, I've got audible and visual.
Okay. I'm assuming that we're still going on, thanks to Sid telling me it's still working. So in 2009, Qatar and Iran, both sharing this massive gas field in the Persian Gulf, put out their deals for creating gas pipelines through Syria, like I've talked about before, through Syria and up to the European markets. We're talking about trillions and trillions of dollars in profits. President Assad took Iran's deal, and Qatar started working with the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria and outside of Syria to help the U.S. foment this rebellion. Qatar, of course, their state-sponsored media is Al Jazeera, and there's Al Jazeera English and other languages, and Al Jazeera Arabic. Well, Al Jazeera English can and has done many excellent reports, but they are the state-sponsored propaganda arm of Qatar. Al Jazeera Arabic is quite different. And Al Jazeera Arabic, during these years leading up to the violence in Syria, they were creating all kinds of crazy propaganda reports that President Assad was going to kill all the Sunnis, that there was going to be a genocide waged against them. Keep in mind, President Assad's wife is Sunni, as are most of the government and most of the army. But this is what was being fed to people in Syria through Al Jazeera Arabic, as well as Al Arabiya, which is Saudi Arabia's channel. In addition to that, Al Jazeera English was preparing the way to create propaganda for the West, so that we would believe all the lies of these so-called rebels that we're starting and we're going to be starting. In 2010, I have an article that talks about Al Jazeera flooding the airwaves with anti-Assad propaganda, similar to what we heard about in Libya, that Gaddafi was going crazy and he was going to kill 40,000 Sunnis, which was a total, absolute fabricated lie. It was very similar to that kind of thing. So this is what Syrians were seeing. They have satellite television and, like I said, the internet, and they were seeing some of these things. In 2010, a year before the violence started, Charlie Rose, a U.S. journalist, interviewed President Assad, and he was so supportive. He was talking about how all roads lead to Damascus. Anybody wanting to do business in the Arab world was heading for Damascus. He was very, positive about the outlook for the country. This was 2010, a year before the violence. Also in that year, Gallup polls listed Syria as the 5th safest country in the world for personal safety. In other words, there were never any suicide bombings, never kidnappings, rapes, murders on the streets. None of this stuff existed in Syria before the U.S. fomented, created terrorist rebellion began in 2011. Also in 2010, hi Sid.
Hello.
Also in 2010, the British show Top Gear actually went to Syria, and they loved it. They went to 5 countries in the Middle East, and it was very clear that Syria was their favorite. And Jeremy, whatever his name is, Clarkson, I think, who's the head host, said Damascus goes straight to the top of all 5 of the best cities of all time, top 5 cities of all time. And so they were raving about it. Again, a year before this so-called popular, organic, spontaneous uprising came out.
Scooch over a little. Remember?
Okay, sure. In 2011, the U.S., of course, created their coalition to take down Gaddafi. We know how that turned out. Libya is a living hell. At that time, our CIA and State Department started funneling weapons from the Benghazi compound, as a matter of fact, into terrorists in Syria. And the people that were going to start this violent revolution were stockpiling weapons in mosques that had been radicalized, both with propaganda and with lots of money from Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and other countries, Turkey, including the U.S., the CIA, and State Department. In 2011, and it's interesting to note that even while all that was going on, there were people in the Pentagon and the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff that were so distrustful of this intelligence they were getting funneled through the political leadership and the intelligence agencies. They didn't believe the intelligence, and they tried to negotiate directly with Libya to find an alternative solution. So this is how crazy Washington has gotten. back to Syria in 2011, there were demonstrations calling for governmental reforms. This is what has to be understood. Many people, everybody wants reforms in the government. There are many issues in Syria that need to be handled, and these will be handled by the Syrian people themselves. And they were calling for reforms. They were not calling for the government to be overthrown in a violent, bloody revolution. There were, however, many people in those demonstrations that were Saudi mujahideen, meaning Saudi fighters, and others who were paid literally to create chaos and to shoot into the crowds and to shoot at the police and the security forces, to create this atmosphere so that Al Jazeera could be there filming it all, and all these people the CIA had been training from 2006 to 2010, they could be there to film it all and make it look like the President Assad was brutally putting down peaceful protests. The extent of the conspiracy is mind-boggling, and I can understand why people have trouble believing it. But I have hundreds of resources to support all of these things that I'm saying. In 2011, sorry, honey, I'm getting there.
You just keep going.
In 2011, U.S. Ambassador Robert Ford in Damascus publicly supports the so-called Free Syrian Army, a group of armed, violent revolutionaries created by the United States of America and supported by them. The U.S. Ambassador Robert Ford publicly declares U.S. support for the Free Syrian Army. And, you know, at that time in 2011, it was very obvious to people in Syria that all of these armed groups were working for the same goal, which was to take down the secular, women empowering society of Syria and replace it with a Sunni fundamentalist, religious-based state based on Sharia law. And this is something that became pretty apparent very quickly on. And the Free Syrian Army and other so-called rebel groups were talking about wanting to take out President Assad, but what they were really doing throughout the course of that time was attacking civilians in Syria. And so people were saying, you know, if you're this big revolution, why are you attacking our little village that happens to be a religious minority village? Why aren't you going to Damascus and fighting the government there? And so this was always against the civilian people of Syria to religiously cleanse the country or to persecute religious minorities, but also, I hate to use the word moderate, rational Sunnis, these very good people who want a secular, women empowering Syria. So it was against all of the good people of Syria, and it was sponsored and created by the, sorry, we have some technical issues going on here, by these religious extremists. I hope I'm doing okay. I just feel like I'm cruising along this. I wanted to say briefly that, it's very well documented by people in our military, our intelligence, other and diplomatic circles of how the U.S. has been knowingly arming terrorist groups in Syria, how those weapons have been funneled, again, with our knowledge. Can we turn that? That's okay.
Well, I just want to keep going.
And that we knew that our weapons were ending up in the arms of Al-Qaeda and ISIS and other terrorist factions there. So it's a big mess. I've got lots more to go through, but basically what happened was in 2015, Russia saw how the U.S. was deliberately arming terrorist groups, supporting Al-Qaeda and ISIS, that we were letting these people run wild through the country, and they came in to help Syria stop it. They were there invited by Syria. Iran was invited by Syria. Hezbollah was invited by Syria. Who was not invited by Syria to help them fight terrorists were the ones who were sponsoring terrorists. And that's the US, UK, France, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey. So that's just a very brief overview, just screamingly fast. And I urge you to look at that resources list that I posted at the top. And hi.
Hello.
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 I got to turn something off there.
What I would like to do, I've already, it shut itself off. The top of the stove or the oven? Happy Mother's Day. I do not know, well, in the United States, here, it's Mother's Day.
Right.
And first and foremost, I want to honor mothers. I want to send deep condolences, first and foremost, to the number one cause of death in the United States military is suicide. And because these good young men and women go in and get handed a nasty bill of sale and can't take it anymore. And the easiest way out is to take their life. And for those mothers, I send a special God bless you. And to all the mothers of people our blessed United States military has killed, to those mothers too, special. We've taken something we cannot give back. I want to show you a picture of my mother.
We thought instead of sharing some of Syrian culture with you tonight,
I have not.
share some of our personal story. He's in charge.
Excuse me for the rudeness. I have not introduced you to my family yet. Here is my mother, Sarah Kirkpatrick Fearing, and she, Southern woman born in Lynchburg, Virginia, went to Sweetbriar College, and I was the last of 5, and she and I were just great buddies. Here's a picture of my father. If he looks a little rough, this was the last time he was physically able to stand up. He passed away right here in this house. And I came home for lunch and he wanted a bite of my lunch. And I started teasing him a bit. And he threw his legs over the side of the bed. I said, Anna, go get a camera. And she got a camera and I got him to he put my hat on. I got him to stand up. We got this picture. So mother, father. Now in our family, if it wasn't a sailboat or it wasn't a fish, you didn't take a picture of it.
Do you want me to hold it up?
No, I got the angle. This was our first boat, a 28-foot wooden cutter, and we sailed it on the Chesapeake Bay for years. They got this boat before I was born. Mom said she remembers when she was so pregnant with me, she couldn't fit between the mast that went down through the deck and the galley, so she stopped cooking then on the sailboat trips. Then we sailed that boat to the Florida Keys, lived there for a year, came back, we're out of boating forever. Then when I was 20, we bought this, a 35-foot Chris Craft motor sailor, and I've slept on that boat 1,000 nights. Took it to the Bahamas 4 times. And Dad, in his younger years, this is off Providence, Rhode Island, fishing with Charlie Mayo. Don't know the weight, didn't bother reading it. Just big old shark. End of the day, they're tuna fishing. So you either catch a tuna or catch a shark. That's a little bit of an introduction to the family and the boats.
That was good, honey.
And the fish. At some point, we'll get an extension. In behind us, there's this, you've seen it a bunch. This is made out of horse. It's an African shield with a wooden frame and a handle. And it'd be real good for stopping a rock or a spear or a dart. There's a 10-pound bass a neighbor caught in a pond. There's a tarpon I caught when I was 10 years old. This is our office or the library. And if I can do this, ceiling. I wallpapered the ceiling with old nautical charts. Only 2 of them are actually mine or ours. The rest of them, I did a job hanging them for the Red Lobster. And when the job was over, I said, what are you doing with the overstock? And they said, you can have them. So I said, beautiful. So I wallpapered the ceiling with charts. I always thought that was so sexy.
Well, I have some pictures here too.
Oh,
so I'll just show one of them. Oh, let's get a little down. So this is a picture from when I was teaching people how to fly ultralight planes, and that's taken on a dry lake bed out in California. So you saw a little bit of our family history tonight, and it's Mother's Day, so I'm about ready to have a drink of rum and a relaxing dinner and an evening with my family.
Well, once again, kind of a quick overview. One thing that Jan said was divide and conquer. And when you look at a map of the region and you've got Iran, Iraq, Syria. Now, you know the word on the ground is Israel hates Iran so much they'll fight them right down to the last American life. And so September 11th happens. I mean, smoke was still rising from the site. And our Pentagon was planning, 2 days after September 11th, we're attacking Iraq. You have to divide, separate Syria from Iran. Boom. We did that schism. Then the next thing, you take the smaller. You would take Syria. Then you drop down and take Lebanon. Then you would take all these Syrian jihadists that are Sunni and send them to the Pearl. The Pearl is Iran. Once you've made a mess of that beauty, then what do you do with the rest of the paid jihadists? Send them up into Russia. Who cares? So that's the big picture. It really is the worst of the worst of the worst. It's slimy, stealing, politics. We're stealing Syrian oil now, north of the Euphrates. I mean, and our Secretary of State is freaking proud of it, with his Bible open on his desk that says, "Thou shalt not steal." Don't listen to what a man says. You listen to what a man does. God bless you all.
Preach it, brother.
Good night.
Good night, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.